right, hello everyone. So in the last video, we ended on slide 12, talking about narrative, kind of thinking how we as people are natural storytellers because of oral culture that we discussed way back when talking about social intelligence. And now we're going to pick up on slide 13, which is still about narrative and logical thought. And one of the first things to keep in mind is that narrative and logical thought are similar, but not necessarily the same. So they're kind of distinctly different and don't have to go together. So you can tell a narrative to somebody and it can twist and turn and wind around to eventually get to the point. But if you break that down into writing and place it, say, in a paragraph, it may make no logical sense. So the narrative in which we speak is often very different from the written logical thought that we read. Logical thought often has a premise that goes through steps that follow one another to eventually get to a conclusion. The conclusion is drawn from specific data within the middle to get generalizations. Sorry, I just heard the door open. I think that was my husband going out. And also deductive and inductive thought is really pulled from logical thought, and our writing system is what has allowed us to have that. So this goes into logico-scientific thought, and this is owed to the invention of writing that allows us to really go step by step. And this kind of forms the foundation of theoretical culture and modern science that allows us to take these step-by-step processes. It allows people to kind of engage in ways of thinking that require analysis rather than, our narrative thoughts that aren't as logical, don't need as much empirical truth, rather than these stories or historical accounts we may tell one another. So this kind of brings us to this other new mental organ. It draws upon external memory storage. So we think of writing and logical thought as being outside of our own heads, so external. And this is knowledge that is stored externally using symbolic stores. So whether that's pictures, graphs, writing. And it makes it so that our working memory is free to think about other things so that we don't constantly have to pull back in information and working memory that we can have outside of ourselves. For instance, I can have my notes here that are written to help guide me along, to help make this make a little bit more sense, rather than trying to keep several paragraphs in working memory. This is connected to also executive functions, executive attention. Executive attention is really important for the invention of writing and the development of analytic thought. It's important for us to plan out ideas, to be able to express those ideas in written sentences, and to be able to record all of that for others. So that brings us to slide 14, the mental organ of writing. So that externalized memory, that memory that's outside of ourselves, permits for collective cognition. So we're not just a single person thinking, but we get to share our thinking with other people. Multiple individuals share access to media that's held in common. Like when you put a tweet out in the world, it's not just your thought anymore. because anybody can now view it and share a glimpse into your cognition. And ultimately, this can apply more collective brain power to, say, a problem that we have in the world. And this kind of goes beyond writing. We can see this in films and different events. We can share, highly processed maps like Google Earth with each other. We can share all kinds of amazing things when you think about, say, the internet and just how much information is there that we've shared with one another on Wikipedia or YouTube or anywhere else that you like to dig for information to learn. And this is more, deeply emphasized by this idea of literacy. And there's this idea by Walter Ong, who stated that without the existence of writing, we wouldn't have philosophy or the arts and sciences, and that we make use of a technology that's been deeply interiorized and incorporated into our mental processes. And that we learn to use writing for a culturally defined set of tasks. One way to think about that writing is for culturally defined tasks, is that different cultures emphasize writing for different things. For instance, there are some cultures and societies and time periods in which diary writing was highly valued and prized. There are still people today who keep detailed diaries. There are some cultures where poetry and writing poems is highly prized. You'll find this a lot in Middle Eastern, Persian, some Arab countries as well, where poetry is so highly prized. Writing music, you think about Greek classical music of the Germans or French or Russians in the 19th century. All of this is writing that was culturally specific. So literacy implies an awareness that written sources can be referenced or, for the facts that they contain, and that somebody else can readily read it and recall that information. And that when you write down your thoughts, that they can help somebody else figure out what you're saying, what you are thinking. So it shows just how important writing and reading are for sharing information with others and building off of that. So it's another example of that ratchet effect. However, if we look at slide 15, there's also sometimes some downsides to writing. One of those is that maybe we rely on it a little too much. So some people will argue that writing has harmed the skills of memory, especially the memory skills that were initially fostered by oral culture. So many cultures emphasized being able to memorize stories, songs, poems that were extremely long. So it wasn't very long ago, only maybe about 200 years ago, that many people were expected to be able to memorize very large portions of the Bible, if not in its entirety, which helped people actually learn new languages when they got a Bible in a different language because they had it memorized in their own language. Similarly, in my own faith tradition, it's still common for people to fully memorize the entire Quran. But it was even more common, over 1,000 years ago, because it was initially completely oral. And so there's a thought that perhaps all of this external memory storage of written works, has expanded our ability to engage logically and with analytic thought, but it's also reduced our reliance on internal memory at the same time. and that, memory for oral language is sometimes fundamental to cultural evolution. And as much as that writing can help with the ratchet effect of moving us forward bit by bit, if we lose out on some of that oral tradition, we also go backwards in other elements. So think about perhaps in your own family. Are there things that you've lost within your family, within your culture, by not having oral traditions? A good example of this is if your family immigrated and lost their native language and didn't have things written down, so they couldn't orally relay information. My family, for some of them, when they moved over, they originally spoke German, and all that we have left are the physical items. And until the members of my family and my generation decided we're going to learn German again, we didn't even know what my grandparents who came over in the late 30s knew. We couldn't translate that over. And so a lot of the information, that oral history, was lost because one generation didn't have the language capabilities anymore. And if you didn't have the language capabilities and you didn't have it written down, then that ratchet effect goes right back down. So in the next lecture, we are going to pick up talking about technology and the internet. The internet is something you are all extremely familiar with, quite possibly much more so than even the textbook, seeing as how it was published in 2013, and you are all technology natives. So I will see you guys later in the next video. Have a great day. Oh gosh, phone is falling.